Okay, so thank you for joining us for this pioneering, in a sense, road ecology workshop on maintenance of wildlife fencing and underpass fencing. This has been, we were able to meet today because of the generous funding from Eastern Georgian Bay Initiative and the support of our partners. So the Land Between is a partner on this initiative, and the Land Between is a charity that strives to care for and connect people to nature in the Land Between bioregion, which extends from Georgian Bay to the Ottawa Valley. We focus right now centrally in the ecotone in this region and towards the east. And we are relying on our partners of Georgian Bay Biosphere in this initiative, who've been wonderful in quarterbacking the outreach and the promotion of this initiative, but also have had quite a history in road ecology and mitigation for reptiles on roads. So I'd like to introduce really quickly Greg Mason to just tell us about the biosphere.
Hello, Annie, bonjour. My name is Greg Mason. I'm the General Manager of the Georgian Bay Biosphere, as well as we are the lead applicant on Mammal and Geotextile, which is the community nominated priority places project that exists on the eastern coast of Georgian Bay. As a UNESCO designated biosphere, the region strives to conserve biodiversity while at the same time looking to sustain livelihoods and basically finding better ways of creating relationships between people and between people and Mammal. We are proudly situated within predominantly Anishinaabe territories and operate within two treaty areas, being the Robertson-Huron Treaty and the Williams Treaty. Leora, thanks very much for extending this work into this area and for the presentation we're having today.
Oh, thank you for being a partner as well. Both the Georgian Bay Biosphere region and the Land Between region, in addition to being in these honored territories, are really key strongholds for reptiles at risk. And so we're really happy to present this workshop because recovering reptiles at risk is a long-term goal. It takes a lot of commitment and a lot of knowledge. And so we're happy to introduce Kerry Gunson. So Kerry started EcoCare International in response to the growing need to mitigate road impacts on Ontario's reptiles and larger mammals. Although she's originally from Ontario, Kerry began working in the field of road ecology in Banff National Park, Alberta from 1999 to about 2005. Banff now has 6 wildlife overpasses and 38 large animal underpasses, and these structures are being implemented on provincial roads in both British Columbia and Alberta. And they're very well known, these overpasses and underpasses, and they're definitely pioneering. So Kerry started working with amphibians in Banff and then moved to upstate New York, where she became acquainted with amphibians and reptiles in Eastern North America. Kerry specializes in designing, installing, and maintaining and monitoring wildlife mitigation systems in Ontario and elsewhere. Kerry's installed over 10 kilometers of exclusion fence for reptiles and has participated in many grassroots projects. She's also conducted a lot of research of her own and is very well published. Kerry is here today to share some of her most formative experiences in road ecology from the last 10 years of monitoring work conducted along Highway 69 from Port Severn to Sudbury. So today's presentation will focus on hands-on maintenance and adaptive management needs along Highway 69 to illustrate and establish a more informed and robust process for ensuring our mitigation dollars and efforts remain effective for the entire shelf life of the products that we are installing. And that's really important for municipalities and other jurisdictions. Before Kerry begins, just a few housekeeping rules. If everyone would, I'd like to invite people, if you've got questions or even comments, to put them in the comments section. And throughout the presentation, we might take a couple breaks where I will read the questions to Kerry so Kerry can respond. And so we will do that either throughout the session or we will wait to the end. But if you have a question that comes to mind, you can write in the comments and it'll be saved and it won't be lost that way. Today's presentation is being recorded. Oh, bless you. If you would mute your thank you very much. That helps in terms of recording. And then, so we're recording this presentation. It'll be sent out to everyone in this group, as well as the stakeholders and individuals and representatives that could not make it today. Today is the first or preliminary workshop that goes hand in hand with a field day that's being held on November 4th. So that's this Thursday in Nobel. And if you need more information, email me or Kerry afterwards. And we will see if there's room in the field day to participate. We are also offering in December a fulsome start to finish workshop on design considerations, materials, and maintenance. And so cost effectiveness of different styles and effectiveness in terms of mitigation of different styles, mixed media, of any exclusion and underpass fencing. So we're doing a fulsome workshop. And when I say we, it's mainly Kerry, but we're hosting that later in December. And so you'll be getting an invitation to that as well. And you're welcome to pass the invitation along to other colleagues that you have. Also today, we'll likely take a break halfway through the presentation. And so it'll be a 10 minutes break, and you can have a washroom break, get a snack, and come back. I think that's it. And Kerry, are you ready to begin?
Yep, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. So
Okay.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen now. And let me know if you can see it.
Yeah, that's good.
Everything good there?
That's good here.
So we got
Again,
visual and
in
audio.
the chat, yeah. In the chat box, anyone who has any concerns, cannot hear, or any questions, please put them in the chat box, or what people would know as the comments box. Thank you.
Yeah, so this workshop webinar, sorry, is being recorded. So if you do need to step out, don't worry about that. It might be a little long. I'm going to try, I have quite a few slides, but most of them are pictures. So I will try and make it about 45 minutes of me going through the maintenance Highway 69 portion. And then at the last 15 minutes, we're going to go over to some details about the field trip and how everything ties together. So the field trip is on November 4th. And I think we realized some of it was short notice to get out to people, and we wanted to cap that at 20 people, so we didn't want to send it to the world at first. So that's how that occurred. We will be videotaping certain pieces of that workshop, so you will have an opportunity to see what we do out there as well with our videos. Okay, so with that, I'm going to talk about wildlife exclusion fencing and underpasses, because we are focusing on reptiles. I'm talking about underpasses and not necessarily overpasses, although we do build overpasses for reptiles. We just don't build as many of them. And there is more underpasses as far as we're concerned for this scope of work. And we're going to talk about focus on the maintenance and adaptive management considerations that go along with getting these mitigation measures implemented. A lot of us in Ontario have implemented specific projects in our areas, but I hear about all the frustrations that go along with it because it's not maintained and or adaptively managed. So we'll get into the details of all of that. So Lior went through our partners, and obviously none of this research would have been made possible without the Ministry of Transportation, who funded the monitoring and adaptive management and maintenance efforts along Highway 69 from 2011 to just about a year ago. So background information. Maintenance, we'll start with some definitions. I'm going to just make sure that I keep going through on my other computer here to get my notes. So, okay. So maintenance, we're going to talk about what we do for routine measures to preserve our desired functionality of exclusion fencing crossing structures, essentially to exclude animals and to keep animals using the crossing structures as best as we can. Adaptive management is they both overlap with each other somewhat. However, adaptive management requires monitoring for us to be able to know what we need to fix. And then we monitor, we fix, we modify, and then we can monitor again and see if our management techniques are working, and then we can put them into best practices. So we're going to talk a little bit about maintenance and adaptive management, and I'll try and separate the two when I can. Maintenance and adaptive management, or lack of, for road ecology mitigation measures is not something in Ontario alone. It occurs in Europe. 24 in a recent review, 24 crossing mitigation projects showed that the mitigation was not as effective as when installed because of the exact same things that are happening here. They might not have as much snow as we have, which makes things even more difficult here. And then in North America, a review of 44 published projects. On average, after 2.2 years, measures were installed, they lost effectiveness and concerns were reported. The good news, maintenance does not necessarily have to cost a lot of money, especially if we install this and we learn from our mistakes and we install it properly to begin with. The bad news, without it, our efforts are pretty much wasted within that window of time of implementation to that 2.2 years when they will be rendered useless. So it is very important, and we have to find a way to get maintenance integrated into our mainstream process. So the rationale for, I've already said that I go around all over North America, I talk to people, I go to conferences, and it's all the same stories that we're hearing. This also isn't new to road ecology as far as temporally speaking. In 1999, when we were working in Banff National Park, they built this amazing 2.4 meter high large animal fence with wood posts. And then the first 5 years, it was great. And then we started to see trees falling on the fence. We started to see washouts. It wasn't buried along the first phase. We started to see animals going underneath. We started to see gates being left open. And we all wondered who was going to do the maintenance, and nobody had the answer. So actually our monitoring group did the maintenance. We would walk it once a month, and we would take a chainsaw and cut the trees off and do what we could. Now there's Banff National Park is doing more for that maintenance, and I'd have to talk to them there to see what, but I know that they've actually even replaced some of their fencing, which is good that they've included the I guess overturn of the materials into their process. So as this series is about importance of maintenance and to provide maybe some hands-on training to all of us, the practitioners and the road agencies and First Nations, non-government organizations, on how we can do this and how we can push for it within our road agencies. And the best practices, I just have to move my arrow here. And then hopefully put these, have a maintenance manual of best practices. So road mitigation for reptiles has been installed and continues to be implemented in Ontario over the past 15 years, but we can definitely do better to improve our effectiveness. So with that, I'm going to focus on Highway 69 because it was a long-term study and we were able to do adaptive management. Highway 69 is being twinned from Sudbury southerly and southerly northerly, and there's different mitigation phases, twinning phases with different styles of mitigation. Shepherd's Lake is the most famous because it was one of the first, and it has, of course, a wildlife overpass in that section. It's also a new highway alignment. So there was a lot of interesting things that could be integrated into that section of highway. It also had measures for reptiles, and measures 4 large animals integrated on that section. And we won't get into the other sections so much. There's Bot, Terra North, we call them after major landforms. Musquash is a river in that section. And then there's Healy, which is named after Healy Lake Road. And sometimes we name it after the construction company as well. And of course, in the red box polygon, you can see Georgian Bay Biosphere, and you can see Highway 69 is the easternmost boundary. And so you can see that obviously the Georgian Bay is a biosphere is a stakeholder in this mitigation. And we will then go into Noble Road, zoom into there as far as the field workshop and what kind of work's been done there. I'm going to move this toolbar again. So this is the study area of Shepherd Lake where we're zooming in, and we're going to talk for the next probably 20 minutes about. And you can see that it has several drainage structures. Then it has 3 dedicated reptile tunnels. It has a wildlife overpass, a wildlife underpass, and it's a new alignment. And it's situated just north of Grundy Lake Provincial Park. Highway 637 to Killarney is pretty much the southerly end. And then Astaire and Burwash are the 2 of the closest towns. I mentioned earlier that there was mitigation for large animals and reptiles. And that's kind of how, when monitoring first started, we thought about it. There was 2 different research projects going on, one with EcoCare, myself, monitoring for large animals, one with Laurentian University, monitoring for reptiles when we all first started. So we kind of thought of the 2, I guess, measures, large and small, kind of separately. But in essence, they should have collectively been thought of together as integrated measures for the entire wildlife community. I think that would have made things a little bit more simpler. Plus, the mitigation may have been installed differently. And we'll talk about that as we go through this section. So here's a picture of the wildlife overpass from drone imagery. And you can see in the middle trail where wildlife have been walking back and forth. And when I was on there last, there was actually beds of grass where animals were resting. We've seen deer dueling on top. We've seen all kinds of birds, cranes, and wild turkeys going across, walking across peacefully. And so it's been a huge success. It was situated where moose vehicle collisions were the highest, but it's used by a lot of, and it has been used by moose, impressively used by moose, and also the rest of the biodiversity that occurs here. So we're going to, I think I brought this up again because I talked about larger animals. I'll just go to there back there. And now we're going to go into the larger animals crossing structures are here. And there is large animal fencing, which I'll show you a picture of, that goes 10 kilometers all along here, along the new alignment. And then there was a focus on reptile mitigation here where the 3 main wetlands and lakes cross the road, and there was 3 larger reptile tunnels. And then there was reptile fencing integrated with the large animal fencing along here. And the target species for the reptile tunnels were freshwater turtles, Blanding's turtles, snapping turtles, and painted turtles. And obviously the Blanding's turtles, through the species at risk and threatened species, impacts on roads were a key driver for these larger reptile tunnels. And they really are quite large, probably the largest in the world, 3 meters by 2.8 meters. That actually is shorter than it is because I'm standing on ice there, but pretty impressive structures. When I saw them being built, I was pretty excited to see them. These are them being built. There was fenced medians. So they left the medians open, which meant that they were only 14 meters on 2 lanes of highway, then they were open, then 14 meters. So the openness ratios of these structures is quite high. And so we were hoping to have a lot of reptile passage, and I can talk about that. However, I want to just point out that they were designated for reptiles because of where they were put in wetland habitat. However, we've also had a lot of other animals use them, and I'll show that as well. So you saw in the picture beforehand, and you'll see it again, the reptile fencing attached to the large animal fencing. We'll talk about that again. So why is fencing important? So fencing is definitely required. If you have a crossing structure at a ravine crossing and you have natural terrain barrier, then perhaps you don't need fencing in those kind of exclusive scenarios. But with this kind of highway where the habitat is homogeneous, you will need fencing. And just to demonstrate that, we showed that 1 year of monitoring this larger animal overpass, we had one cross and most of them just walked right by. And then the following year, and maybe 4 months of monitoring, same amount of time before and after, when we had fencing, we had 7 crosses and two walked by. So less we're ignoring it and more we're using it. And that number of crosses increased as we kept monitoring. It actually increased a lot for more adult females going through with their offspring for ungulates, we noticed. And so this shows you the entire integrated fencing where I showed you along the 3 kilometers of highway where those reptile tunnels are. That's one of the reptile tunnels. You can see the terrain around here, lots of rock. And you can see that this was attached to the large animal fence. It's a stronger geotextile. And we'll get into types of fencing another time, but I just wanted to give some, on this specific study, give some detail on what we're looking at here. So it was a stronger black geotextile that was buried. It was, the large animal fence was installed first, implemented first, and this was attached later. So this is something that we may want to refine as we think about these things, is to do everything all at the same time. And then that way you can put them together, put the 2 types of measures can be installed easier together. Whereas when this was installed, the reptile fence was installed here, it had to go exactly where the large animal fence was. And we weren't quite advanced in our information experience to deal with that, which the Ministry of Transportation has done as they went southerly, and I'll show you some of that. So monitoring between large animals and reptiles, I was talking about the differences between road ecology for these different groups of animals is different. It's very much different. You cannot conduct the same techniques to capture large animals as you can for reptiles unless you give it some careful thought. So that's precisely what we did, was we tried to integrate monitoring for all the animals without too much effort. Reptiles needs time lapse, and large animals will be captured with motion. So we needed to think about that, and to think about our budget, think about when the animals are moving in order to catch everything at the structures. So we focused on the 3 reptile tunnels to capture large animals and reptiles together, and we put the camera on the roof, and we used both time lapse and motion. Time lapse during June when turtles were moving. And we also put this rock barrier wall with an opening for the reptiles so that they would go right underneath the camera. So reptile monitoring, when I talk about reptile monitoring, we're talking about 2 things. One is cameras on crossing structures to measure use. These are the 2 main pieces of data that road ecologists collect. And then we're also talking about roadkill information or crossing information, live animal crossing information. And so we monitor roads for those movements and for those animals that have been killed by vehicle strikes. So we look at all that information together. So it started with Laurentian and James Baxter Gilbert in 2012 and 13 as part of a master's, and then continued by EcoCare in 2015. And that's when we started to integrate the large animal and reptile monitoring together. So there was a paper published, and the paper was titled Mitigating Reptile Road Mortality, Fence Failures, Compromise Ecopassage Effectiveness. So we're going to go and talk about the fence, details of this fence at this point. So I kind of wonder whether or not fence failures contributed to ecopassage use along these reptile tunnels, because if you look at, we don't have defined monitoring, formal monitoring previous 2015, but if you look at the fence, the use of each of the three structures, it is relatively stays the same. And then there's a big jump at Reptile Tunnel 1. That could be because of adaptive management, because we actually made the fence more continuous along, it was only on one side north of that structure. So this is possible, and we're going to go through that and what exactly happened in these 5 years of monitoring. Grab some water. Hope everybody's still awake. We're going to get into the good stuff now. So what happened in 2012? The fence was constructed. The fence was implemented on this the 3 kilometers. Some of it was continuous and some of it had gaps, was put in 2012. In 2013, as part of James's monitoring, he found that there was more roadkill from when the fencing was installed. So we can essentially say that it appears that the fencing isn't doing anything for roadkill. So what we did after that was we started to say, okay, well, let's see why this happened. So in year 1, we performed a massive assessment. So this was an entire fencing report where we looked at, okay, what's going on here? What's wrong with some of these sections of fence? So it wasn't necessarily minor tears as one thought. It was that this was a new alignment and there was changing hydrology. So that was the biggest factor, I think, in any of the breaches that occurred along this somewhat continuous 3 kilometers of fence. So the first thing we did was find all the washouts that occurred from storm events, from changes in hydrology patterns, from beavers coming into the area. There was a lot going on. And so it took us a little while to figure it all out. So that's exactly what we did. Year 1. We also found that at the drainage culverts, this was not at the reptile tunnels, that the posts were not cemented in like they were as you move further southerly on the mitigation section. Fence posts are cemented in with a footing. So here it wasn't, so we had to fix all that. And then we found that some of the exclusion fence, the hog rings that were used to attach it had not been closed properly. And so that's a big deal. Also, we found that there was erosion from the riprap coming down and weighing it down. And then we found changes in hydrology where the water would come. And so we cut some of it out and we put rock barrier walls in there. So this is exactly what we started doing. I mentioned a portion of the exclusion fence was installed in a wetland. And it should have been, again, I talked about that. We installed the large animal fence. Large animal fence is easier to install in wetlands. The other fence, reptile fence at the bottom when it's wet, is not easy to install. So that reptile fence should have been pulled out and it should have been on higher ground. So those were the things that we learned later. We learned through this project and were implemented as we went south. Also of interest was that a beaver dam was constructed along the large animal fence. So this kept the water levels high. So they never came down. So we had an issue there where we couldn't, the reptile fence was submerged. Obviously turtles could swim over. So we put this up here, thinking that the turtles can move through the gaps in the one-way gate. Obviously, and James Baxter Gilbert had observed that. And then also we thought that the large animal fence here has some functionality and excluding turtles because it's 6 inches wide. So obviously little guys could get through, but the larger adults couldn't. What we would like to do is add another piece, make the reptile fence higher, or as I said, pull it out and do that piece of adaptive management. So that's what happened in 2015. We started to do all this. This is that rock barrier wall we built where the water was going through the fence. And that rock barrier wall is solidified each year with maintenance. So that was 2015. So we monitored and we reduced. So now we are at plus 30. Now we're at minus 53% reduced road mortality from baseline. So in year, sorry, I'm just going to go make sure I'm on track with this. Year 2 in 2016, or year 1, we still had road mortality. So we wanted to, you know, why are we still getting road mortality? Where are they breaching the fence? So we went back and did, in 2016, we got approvals to do more of adaptive management. We want to make the fence integrated, the reptile fence integrated with the large animal mitigation. And I talked about that. That didn't happen in the design. And so now we want to extend the reptile fence along the large animal fence from the reptile tunnels through the wetland, providing a buffer after the wetland and extending right to the large animal underpass. And then we can monitor the large animal underpass for all animals. So that's exactly what we did. We extended it 300 meters. We also extended it on the northerly end to continue. There was about 50 meters that needed to be extended to one of the drainage culverts. So we could do that, make that more continuous. So now we had 3 kilometers on each side of continuous reptile exclusion fence, and we extended it past the wetland habitat. So that in year 2, we noticed we even improved it even better. We had 92% drop. And so we only had 1 turtle roadkill, whereas we had 6 in 2015. So in year 3, we still wanted, why do we have that 1 turtle? So we could obviously plot where that 1 turtle was and see where we could focus our more of our efforts. And we thought, because that 1 turtle was killed, roadkill, it was a smaller snapping turtle, we thought it was because it got through that flooded section. So we, as I showed you, that 6 inches, it was a smaller than 6 inches snapping turtle. So we thought for sure it went through there, and because it was pretty close, about 200 meters from that spot. So we didn't focus there because we at that point we were not responsible for that piece of adaptive management. It was on the books, but it didn't get done. So what we did in 2017 was we just kept up maintenance with the bottoms of the fence where it was exposed. We put Urtec that provided drainage. We put some of that up, and then we monitored again. And then we had 2 roadkill turtles, and it was again at the same location where that flooded section occurred, where the beaver had dammed against the fence. So we went back to that section and we looked at it thoroughly. And my field technician looked at me and said, "Have we ever gone up on this rock cliff?" And I said, "No, we have never gone up there." So we went up there and we found this. We found a hole that the flap of the geotextile was there, but it was not anchored. So we anchored it with pegs, stakes, and rocks. And then we said, let's go for a walk through this forest where you can't even see the exclusion fence. And we kept walking and walking. And behind this forest, we found 20 meters and a one-way gate where the contractors probably ran out of fencing material and did not go back and finish that piece. So that was exactly where those reptile tunnels were getting through. So we closed all that up. And in year 4, we reached our milestone where we had no roadkill along that section. And so 2018 onwards, we've been doing maintenance, routine maintenance at this point. And we have not, even though we haven't been monitoring systematically, we have not found any roadkill turtles on our opportunistic visits as we do camera monitoring. So I'll take a little section there. A break. Here, this shows exactly where those 2 snapping turtles were. And that's where we close them off. And that was all in this section is where we were having that forest and the flooded section, and that rock cliff was all up in here. And then we had, this is the flooded section actually right here. So you can see they were a little bit off. So we were wondering how they got from there to there. So that's when we found those issues. And then this was why we extended the fence, because we had these roadkills here at the end of the fence. We moved it over to the underpass. So the jump outs, we're going to talk about more of this in the next series of workshops, and where jump outs should be used. And you know, it might be overkill to have a lot of jump outs, simply because jump outs entail maintenance. Jump outs also entail being installed properly. And so I'm sure that when a contractor sees these jump outs in the designs, and they don't know, they've never seen these before, don't necessarily understand what they're for, there can be error in their installation. So the one on the top left was installed properly. This one was not installed properly. This one needed to be closed off because it was level on both sides. The idea is that it's supposed to be high here, so a turtle can't access this side, but if a turtle got on the wrong side, it can access on this side because this is level here and it goes over. So that's a well installed one. So we'll talk about if these are even needed and when they're needed in the next series. So the one thing that is very important to consider with just having large animal fence is that when it is submerged, we need definitely to fix that situation, because even though it's 6 inches and there was some functionality for turtle exclusion, there's also a chance of injury or death by a turtle getting stuck in there. So since then, we have actually put another piece up here, so of Urtec that allows water to flow through. And this was a turtle on the wrong side, and this was only large animal fence. And so this is important to make sure that we get them back on the safe side. And so we have to think about all of these kind of scenarios. This is a Blandings turtle that was found near the wildlife overpass. So it gives you kind of rationale to extend that exclusion fencing even further. The wildlife underpass that we extended to is just beyond there, 300 meters. So if we extend another 500 meters, then we could probably get these this wetland where there's Blandings turtles. One thing we noticed with our turtles is that they're tenacious and that they will do whatever they can to walk along the fence and find a breach point. So this is an example of where we had a roadkill hotspot of turtles, 3 turtles from our monitoring here in about 2 years of monitoring. And this is Healy Lake Road. This is one of the mitigated sections where it ends here. And it's a nice tie-in to an abutment. And so what turtles do is they go up here, they cross Healy Lake Road, and they come down here and they cross and they're getting killed there. So we need to think about mitigation. Fencing has to end somewhere. So we need to think about what we can do there. Perhaps this is a wetland habitat, so we need to extend the fencing past the wetland habitat. That's the next series of workshops. Adaptive management, maintenance. That could be an adaptive management piece. So earlier I said that maintenance should really only take 1 to 2 days, annual maintenance. And once you get it going, after the first 1 or 2 years, and you get all the little concerns, then it should really only take 1 day, 2 people 1 day. We're going to show how simple maintenance can be on Noble Road. And I think that reptile fencing, now that we've improved the hog rings, improved the hydrology and things like that, the actual material itself doesn't get pummeled by snow. It's far enough back. So we predict that with 1 day of maintenance each year, we predict that exclusion fencing could last up to 10 years and be functional. Large animal exclusion fencing has structural benefit for animals, but we have to be careful in that we make sure there is some kind of a rock wall so that the reptiles don't get stuck underneath or try to climb in there. So this is what we were trying to do there, was build a rock wall. this fence wasn't buried, you could go under, so animals could go under as well. So if we could put rock wall or more geotextile, this is near the overpass, and then we would be in improving the situation for all the wildlife. New highway alignments are difficult to fence due to the changing hydrology is the biggest piece, especially when you're looking at reptiles and wetland habitat and Canadian shield rock. It's very difficult. So none of this is easy by any means. You can see this is further south by Healy, and this is where we went to, the Ministry of Transportation went to a mesh exclusion reptile barrier for drainage purposes, because when you get into a situation like this, then you need that kind of drainage. And again, next series, I'm just giving you little glimpses of next series. This is type of fence. I talked about pulling back from wetland. So the large animal fence can go through a wetland much easier than the reptile fence, because it can't be buried. The reptile fence, as we know from Long Point Causeway, installing a fence in water for reptiles is very, very difficult to maintain, et cetera, et cetera. So they pulled this back onto the rock, added substrate to fill it. And this is what we're dealing with, is big rock boulders everywhere. So something that was interesting, I talk about that in a sec. What this slide is showing is that we have maintenance that needs to be completed at wildlife underpasses as well. Everybody thinks wildlife underpasses are good to go, especially if they're large. But that's not true, especially in wetland environments where the vegetation grows thick with cattails, and we need to clear that veg on an annual basis so we can have a turtle path. And I've seen that a lot in the Georgian Bay area. And also beavers come in and dam. So we started a rock wall for our camera monitoring. The camera's on top of this crossing structure, and the beaver started his dam on that rock wall. And but the beaver also likes to travel through this crossing structure. So the beaver followed our design and built the dam up so the water was dammed, but kept a walkway path for its family to go through. And here we have turtles using this walkway, no problem, climbing up onto the dam and over. So that was interesting. So I'm just going to go into a little bit of monitoring. I'm about 44 minutes in. So what I'm going to suggest, I'm going to fill up my water glass and take a minute. Liara, if that works.
Yeah, so how about if anyone has questions, again, please put them in the chat. And
yeah, I can answer some.
Yeah, and we'll take a 10-minute break and come back at, geez, what time is it now? We'll come back at, it's 1:45 so we'll come back at 2. But before we leave and take a water break, maybe Kerry can talk about so maybe I'll say quickly is that we're offering these workshops sort of backwards. The reason we're doing maintenance now instead of design considerations and is because of the season. So we still have time to do a field component and show you maintenance before the snow flies so that it's obvious to the participants. But in an ideal world, we would have offered the design considerations before the maintenance. So for practitioners who are just coming on board and seeing this now, maybe Kerry, you could make a couple comments about the need to understand species biology when designing these, and maybe the need for road permeability. So there is a need to work with biologists and engineers when designing these. Can you make
yeah, maybe what I'll do, Liara, is I go through a couple of these questions right now, and then I'll come back at in 10 minutes at 5:22 and answer some more.
Okay, well, right now we just have one question.
Okay.
So,
sorry, so you need to integrate species biology into the fencing?
I just maybe was asking for you to comment to all the viewers right now about the need to understand the biology and behavior of species when designing these fences. So it's not just an engineering exercise, that they need to be tailored to the species and their biology and their behavior.
Yeah, so the one thing you may have noticed about Shepherd Lake, there's obviously snakes there, but there's not a lot of snakes. As far as when you go further south and into the Georgian Bay area, Georgian Bay Biosphere area. I think they call it the Perry Sound MNRF district. Then you get a lot of snakes. So there wasn't, we call this the Sudbury district. There wasn't a lot of snakes. The mitigation was not necessarily designed for snakes. Snakes are harder to design mitigation for because they can maneuver and go around little nooks. So when we talk about breach points for turtles, you can imagine for a snake, like a small little hole would be a breach point for these guys. They're also harder to monitor with cameras because they move around your camera field of view and you don't know which way they went. So that's something to keep in mind. And I talked about large animal versus reptiles and the designs there. You definitely have to keep in mind the biology. We don't have fox snakes in the Sudbury district that we know of. So the fencing for turtles and for even mass doesn't have to be that high, 60 centimeters with a lip, or even 60 centimeters to 90 centimeters is fine for these guys. Snapping turtles, yes, they can climb. Whether they would climb that large animal fence and get over it, it would be hard to envision, but definitely not impossible. From what I've seen with turtles and what they'll do, that everything you have to keep in mind their biology and that they want to move overland.
Yeah,
definitely.
Okay, and well, I'm sure we'll talk more about species behavior and designing with caring for those species in mind, and not just caring for our short-term needs. So one of the questions and comments were the passes and fencing are obviously a great way to stop roadkill and injuries on roads, which is amazing, but is it helping the populations overall? Are there studies done to find out if the population numbers of species are benefiting? I'm wondering if predators are using the overpasses to hunt or population diversity is decreasing.
Yes, hunting. I don't know if hunting is happening at the crossing structures more than what happened elsewhere. We've had one incident where we saw an otter capturing a snapping turtle at one of the drainage structures. But you know, how often does that happen? And otters catch snapping turtles away from crossing structures as well. And as far as population, that's a little bit more difficult. That's more a PhD level type question. And you know, somebody like Sean Boyle, who just did his PhD at Presqu'île, looked at some of those questions to see if there was enough connectivity with the crossing structures for the abundance of turtles and the herp community around the structures. And he found that there was. I'd have to read that thesis a little bit more in detail. And they found that there was enough crossings of grizzly bears by doing DNA genetic studies in Banff National Park to maintain demographic diversity, genetic diversity between the populations on both sides of the Trans-Canada Highway. So yes, so there is evidence that we are doing this, and that's a really good thing. But it's just hard to measure. I would like to measure that in along Shepherd's Lake and to look at the abundance of turtles at the 3 crossing structures, just to see whether or not why we're getting more crossings at Reptile 1, which I'll talk about later, but it's located in a really cool spot. But I would also like to know if there's more turtles in that area, and that might be influencing it. It's a very important question. You could maybe do it with pitfall traps around the area on a straight transect from the cross structure. That would be intensive monitoring. You'd have to have somebody walk it 2 times a day.
Okay, thank you for that, Kerry. So definitely this is a mix of expertise between biologists and engineers, and it's good to have the two groups today in this workshop. So we'll take a 10-minute break and come
Sure.
back at 2
At 2.
o'clock.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. I'll
And the
get some
link is
water.
live for everyone as well. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, I just have to figure out how to share my screen again.
It should be.
Yeah, my window's small, it's minimized, so I can't.
Oh, in the top,
here.
top right. Yep.
Hold on. I'm still. Show small, active, hide thumbnail, grid view. Uh-oh.
So also while you're doing that, David said he could share the Baxter, Gilbert, and Boyle links. So I'm not sure why it is not shareable in the chat. It should be. So
yeah, on my website, on the what's new, I have all the public report from this Shepherd's Lake monitoring, and I think I have a link to James because it was +1.
okay, and for now, I've sent David a link to my email and actually share it to everyone. And if you have resources to share, then we can share them with everyone through email. So I'll put my email again in the chat, and maybe just email it to me, and I'll then share it in the chat back to everyone just to make things easier. And we'll also share them when we share the recording of this as well.
Can you see my screen now?
Yep, your screen's ready to go. It looks good.
Okay, good.
Okay.
So I left off to talk about maintenance, some examples at the using Shepherd's Lake as an example, new alignment. There was lots of maintenance, lots of adaptive management, but at the end of the 4 years of doing this, we learned a lot, which a lot of lessons learned were implemented in subsequent phases southerly, and also we were able to reduce roadkill. And we are still monitoring the 3 reptile tunnels, and that's what I'm going to go into a little bit more. I know everybody likes monitoring. When we talk about monitoring, we talk about crossing structure use. We also, some people like to hear about road mortality, but most people don't. But that's what we do for monitoring, is we collect road mortality data and crossing structure, and we look at the effectiveness of the underpass fencing system. So we're not having a workshop. Lior and I talked about it. We'll probably do a workshop on monitoring next year, because that's a whole new ballgame for large animals and for mammals, even for how do you monitor birds that fly across a crossing structure. But reptiles is definitely something that's difficult. Some people do pit tagging, and then you have to capture your animals. And so in Windsor, Steve Marks put a lot of pit tags and snakes, and that's how he did his monitoring. You have to capture a lot of animals to be able to monitor that. And in this study, we actually used several different camera setups before we got it right. But the trick is that you have to use consistent camera monitoring at your structures if you want the data to be comparable across structures. So with larger mammals, that might be a little easier to say that it was consistent within a marginal error. But with reptiles, you could have your camera flooded out, you could have your rock wall be submerged at the bottom, and then it's not submerged, and then it's a barrier. You can have different things happening. Your cameras, one can be better than the other, one can last longer on batteries. So that's when you want to go to solar and consistent power supplies. So that's a whole nother workshop. So what I'm going to show you here is that some of the results and what we're trying to do. So we're monitoring these cameras consistently from 2016 to, I think maybe 2015 to 2022. We have 8 selected crossing structures along close to each other, so that we can somewhat say that it's comparable. But the biggest issue there again is we have more turtles probably at one location than another, even if they are only 300 meters apart, simply because of the hydrology in the system. And turtles, specific species of turtles use specific wetlands more than others, and things like that. So that is much more difficult to study than large animals, where you compare wildlife overpass with a wildlife underpass, 300 meters apart. You're hoping you have the same deer population in both those areas. So those are some things to consider. So I showed this graph already, and this is the results without 2020 and 2021. We do not get a lot of turtles in the reptile tunnels. This is consistent monitoring. So if a battery died in one reptile tunnel, that data set had to be pulled from all of the reptile tunnels, because then that it wasn't consistent among and comparable. So we wanted to have the same time frame, I had to be on time lapse on all three of them, all at 15 seconds. And we can see reptile tunnel 1 is doing better, and we'll say possibly why. There was some adaptive management, as I mentioned, but it consistently did better, except for 2016 at all of them in each year. So there's something there that is making reptile tunnel 2 is at Shepherd's Lake, and but it's dry on one side and wet on the other. And reptile tunnel 3 did well in 2017, but not in the other years. So it's the sample size is low, and what's going on. So we could start to try and look at the hydrology, and where reptile tunnel 1 is here. It's connected, it's right in that connected wetland system. It's wet throughout the tunnel from each side and in the middle. Reptile tunnel 2, as I mentioned, it's not in Shepherd Lake. It's to the west of Shepherd's Lake. So it's a little bit off. And so it's dry there and it's wet on this side. So that's could explain why this one's getting more. And then wetland, reptile tunnel 3 only has wetland on one side. So that could explain why that's getting the least amount of passage. So those are, I think it's all about hydrology. And I think that you have to put your crossing structures in water movement flows if you want them, the turtles, to use them. That's where we get most of our passages in most published studies. In the culverts that are right in the wetland causeway, they get a lot of passage. So what we want to do next was the biggest and most difficult, challenging study, because of all the reasons I just said, was to look at the larger reptile tunnels versus the smaller drainage tunnels next to them. We don't have a lot of replication. We have 3 reptile tunnels and we have 2 smaller drainage culverts a little bit further north. So we're monitoring, that's part of our 8 selected crossing structures. And we're going to keep monitoring. So we got a contract from Canadian Wildlife Service to actually keep this monitoring going for 2 more years. And that just happened this spring, summer. Okay, so there. This is a snapshot of the diversity of animals, reptiles that we found at our crossing structures that we have pictures of. And so this isn't just at Shepherd's Lake. There was a selection at other structures as we went further south. So in total, we probably monitored about 20 structures for 3 years. So we're getting quite a diversity, but again, we don't know if a lot of these snakes went through, but the ones that we were able to determine whether they turned around or whether they crossed, we're able to do a comparison. I think I'm going to talk about that right now. A comparison of turtles and snakes passage rates. Passage rates is a common measure that we use in road ecology. So it's the crossing plus crossing, the number of crossings. So approach and crossing on the numerator, and on the denominator, we add in the number of repels. So as the repels increase, which means they come in and they turn around, the repels increase, passage rate goes down. So we can look at that, and it's a proportion. So we can look at that and make it a comparison across taxa or species. And so we did that here, and we found that turtles' passage rates were higher than snakes. And we found that in 2 studies. So the passage rates are higher for turtles there and for snakes. So there's more passages than turnarounds there. You can tell the discrepancy, the difference between those two bars is greater than with snakes, and that was significant. Then we can look at the same thing, passage rates, the crosses and the turnarounds, and compare them for species. And we haven't done a statistical test on this data yet. We're going to compile it from all the years and then look. And we found that 88% of the Blanding's turtles that went, even though the sample size is low, so we don't have a good, there's not necessarily a good proportion in the first place, but we had 88% of them that came into the tunnel go through, and snapping turtles was the most. So snapping turtles might be because they're larger and more brave and strong, and they're maybe less or more tolerant of their surroundings when they're going through a structure. So I said that we use different methods for monitoring, and if we use motion detection, because we put motion on one side and time lapse on the other, and we did a comparison, and I'd have to go back to the report to see how exactly we did that, but we would have missed 84% of the turtles on if we only had used motion. So time lapse is very important. We played around with the 15 seconds and the 30 seconds. We missed turtles on 30 seconds. 15 seconds, we at least caught a tail or some piece of it. And we knew that again because we had one in 15 seconds at one side and one in 30 on the other. Is one camera enough? Yes. If you use 15 seconds, one camera was enough on the structures. That's a question that a lot of people ask because there's a lot of pictures taken on time lapse every 15 seconds. We did ours during the day from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. because the first year we had 24 hours and we found that 98%, I think we had one night encounter at a crossing structure with a turtle. So we did it just during the day diurnal hours. This is a mention of the otter having the snapping turtle at one of the drainage culverts. And so that was really interesting to catch that on film. And we also found that the temperature of when the turtles are crossing peaked at 1700, 5 o'clock p.m. was also when the temperature was the highest in the crossing structures. So this is in the month of June. And we also found, again, this was consistent time lapse 15 seconds at the 3 reptile tunnels so that we could compare temporally as well as spatially. And we found that at week 2, there was a peak in crossing those 3 reptile tunnels. And then there was another peak at week 4. And we find that also with our movement and our crossing roadkill data. We find that the turtles are moving at the same time as they're crossing roads at the same time that they're crossing the crossing structures. And we're going to compare those 2 data sets as well. So the bimodal peak, early nesters, late nesters, painted turtles nest more than 1 time a year. So that could be what's happening here. And we found it in all 3 years, these peaks. So that was interesting as well. So I've talked about all the problems with the monitoring and how we need long-term studies, especially here when we only are getting a handful of turtles crossing in June. And again, I would have to look at population abundance to know whether or not why are we only getting a handful of turtles at these crossing structures? Are they in the right place? Or how many turtles are what's the need for them to cross? Is there enough habitat on one side and they don't need to cross? So those are kind of things that are a little bit more difficult to look at. And so we would like to do multivariate studies and get some population measures in the area would be the best case scenario. 15 seconds, we talked about best settings. Could be technical difficulties with each camera. Maybe we should purchase brand new equipment and start because some of this equipment's about 5 or 6, 7 years old. Low sample size, we talked about that. We talked about population abundance. So we know that reptiles are more reluctant to use underpass tunnels than mammals because of physiological reasons, but mammals are skittish too. They're showing some hesitancy to go through the crossing structures at first, in the first couple of years, and then they seem to warm up. So we want to look at longer term studies to see if the reptiles will use them more as they learn to use them. I put here, are we doing more bad than good? That would be a topic that we'll discuss at the next series. If you cannot mitigate properly, then you should probably go to mitigate with underpasses and fencing properly. If you can't do it all, the maintenance, have the crossing structures, then you should think about whether or not that site is appropriate. Because as you said, as there's been observations of reptiles having to walk long distances along exclusion fencing, amphibians, and being found dead along the fence. So we need to really think about where we put this stuff and whether that site is good along this section of highway, and most of the sections between all the drainage structures and the designated crossing structures, there's quite a few. So we just have to get them in there. So there's adaptive management that you could do to try and get them in. And I'll talk about that in another slide. So I talked about the diversity of animals at reptile tunnels, and we had an increase of lynx using the reptile tunnels in the 9th year. Well, we only monitored for the reptile tunnels since 2016. So after about 3 years, we found the last year of monitoring in 2019, we found about 4 lynx using 2 or 3 of the tunnels. Could have been the same lynx. We'll look at the pictures more closely. And lots of smaller animals, deer and American bittern using the structures. So that was a lot of beavers going through for sure. So Leora and I were talking about doing a follow-up survey and getting the practitioners and people's ideas on how we can get maintenance done on these projects, and whether it's getting transportation agencies all in one room in a workshop, finding out how it can be enforced, how we can get it written into contracts, how we can make I guess wildlife crossing structure maintenance as important as road safety maintenance. Possibly, I don't ever see that necessarily happening, but definitely, even if the contractors that are looking after these roads cannot do the maintenance for whatever reason, don't want to do the maintenance, then we need to find somebody that will do the maintenance. So how do we procure maintenance? Can we get practitioners that are trained to do maintenance, such as EcoCare International could have a staff of 5 people going around to mitigation sites all over Ontario and doing the mitigation. I don't really have the resources to do something like that, but maybe Blazing Star does. So these are the kind of things that we can think about. School groups, First Nations, getting First Nations, habitat stewardship programs, getting these groups out there and having ownership and responsibility of the mitigation, of the conservation of their lands, and looking after these measures that we are spending a lot of money on installing. So there's also community groups, obviously, that we see on Facebook, the Heart Lake Troopers and things, and Turtle Guardians and things like that. If we can get these groups involved, then we can perform maintenance until we find out how to make it mainstream. Maybe it is going to be part of these groups that do the maintenance, but we do have to figure out how to do it because it's so valuable, as we saw from the Shepherd Lake study. Okay, so with that, I'm going to talk about Noble Road. It's more relevant for people who are coming on the field excursion, but it's also interesting too. So it doesn't mean that you have to go if you're not coming on this field excursion. I'm just going to go into.
Kerry, before we move on to that, would you answer some questions that have come up?
Sure.
Okay, and with regards to the survey we will send out, it's also going to help us identify, we're going to be asking about obstacles that municipalities and nations are facing in terms of capacity, so we can understand those better to find solutions and maybe to help broker solutions. So we definitely need to understand the challenges in terms of maintenance. And so we'll be asking a two-pronged survey about that as well. So one of the questions that came in is, what are the typical, and this might be addressed in our longer workshop, but what are the typical mistakes in installation that increase issues with maintenance?
Technical difficulties that increase the need for maintenance, or yeah, the efforts that we need for maintenance kind of thing?
Yeah, I believe it relates to the technical issues. Maybe they haven't tied in the fencing or bounded the wetland, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so definitely that's going to be big in our next workshop, and how we can reduce maintenance. What are the factors? And obviously there's a lot. So if you choose your materials well, and if you choose your materials well for the terrain and for the site, and you design it properly with the right amount of jump outs and the right fence ends, but there's a lot to think about. Like we saw that, so we can see that there might be a mistake, and that can happen. And I see that the fence tie-in ends 20 meters before a bridge abutment and things like that. So it's just, I think, overseeing the design drawings, having more people trained within transportation agencies, within the practitioners, and having these kind of workshops. And with time, I think we can improve the need for maintenance, as I said, to limiting to 3 kilometers of fence to 1 day each year. 2 people go out and do the maintenance. That's what I predict, 8 hours, 16 hours, having those materials on hand. Maintenance is inevitable, but you definitely can reduce it to, if you put in concrete below grade rock walls. We've seen limestone, we've seen concrete waste blocks be used for exclusion fencing. And you integrate drainage properly with those structures, then you obviously have half the battle covered. But the problem is that you will always have vegetation, and you will always need to trim that vegetation. It might not be every year, but you should do it probably every 2 years before animals can use it overgrows, and the animals can use that vegetation to get over the crossing structure.
So having partners, biologists at the front end with the design to understand turtle behavior, to make sure the fence ends are appropriate and not too short, within, I've seen, for instance, fences that end within a wetland. And so the turtles get onto the road because they feel very comfortable in wet, low areas. And so because the fence is not bounded the wetland, they get on the road, and then they're bouncing back and forth between 2 fences, and it increases potentially, the issues. So
think like a turtle.
So in order to think like a turtle, I guess the answer to that would be work with the biologists when you're designing these projects.
Yeah, and we do, but you certainly need a biologist that has some road ecology experience, just to think about, jump outs. How many jump outs do we need for what I would say from experience, and without knowing how effective these jump outs are, if you have a really, really rigorous mitigation system and you've built your fencing well and you have your crossing structures, you shouldn't have breaches. So why do you need jump outs? If you have maintenance, why do you need jump outs? But if you have fencing on one side, you need jump outs. If you have an access road and you have a breach point that you can't do anything about, then you might need a jump out on the other side of that access road. That makes sense, but we don't need them every 1 kilometer. Why waste the money? Just install your mitigation properly.
Okay, so there's a lots to cover in our upcoming design workshop in December. So another question was, do you have cameras custom focused for culvert use? And if so, to what range?
Custom cameras. The cameras that we used at one point was Active Beam, and they were from the States, but it was kind of a small little workshop setup. So we didn't have customer service and can't go to the States with your camera. So we ended up, Active Beam works well with reptiles. There's a new one with Hobbs. But again, your coverage, your range is, I don't think it's very far with those cameras, maybe 10 feet. And also they don't work in water. So we're back to this they're way more challenging to monitor. So we went with the time lapse. We found that that was the best in the end of the day with all those settings and scenarios and parameters that we used. We found it was probably the most robust method for sure. And so the time lapse, if your camera is, they say the focus on those is about 15 meters. At night, it's different. So if you had a time lapse camera going for 15 minutes and a clear shot at that animal, then you can use it up to 15 meters. On the wildlife overpass, so you'd run into vegetation, you have to have it low. You could have it on a tree. We had some on a tree, but for time lapse, again, you would need to have time lapse to capture smaller animals.
The next question is, has there been any attempt at naturalizing the eco passages? So not along the fencing, but the underpasses or the overpasses. For instance, placing sticks along the passageway to give reptiles some cover. And maybe that also relates to the otter picture we saw, and to maybe less hesitancy to use these underpasses.
Yeah, we haven't done that enough, and that's really, really important. But on the overpassers, debris, woody piles possibly for snakes and for smaller mammals for cover. And so those are really cool. And there's some boulders and rocks and everything. So I'm sure the snakes are quite happy up there. The pools of water would be nice. Thinking about just little pools to hydrate. They've tried that in Europe. So, but the pump that they used to pump the water was not maintained. So, but you could make natural pools of water, but of course there's drought. So, and the underpasses, we haven't done that enough, and we should do that more by keeping those open medians and having natural vegetation in those open medians is really nice. I think that's a great thing to do. And then in the underpasses, putting maybe some elements of cover, definitely in there.
Okay, so lots of areas for improvement and quite a complex, I guess, undertaking. And that's why we need all the brains at the table.
Yeah, and a lot of adaptive management. You can add a lot of this stuff afterwards too. So you have to make sure that the procurement's there, the flexibility, and do you permissions for you to go in there and change these things. The reason why we were allowed to do so much of what we did was because we were it was a retainer. So we were able to suggest, work with the agency and say, can we do this? Can we do that? What do we need to do? So the procurement was done. If the procurement is not done, we have to apply for grants. And then we have to get the grant, and then you have to spend it within the government 1 year. So we had a 3-year window, which allowed us to be flexible. So that's half the battle.
So we'll find more answers. We're hoping through this survey as well, when we understand the challenges and infrastructure and capacity.
Right.
The next question is, how long does the geotextile fence last when attached to the large mammal fence?
There's a lot of different kinds of geotextile fence. There's that's a whole workshop. There's silk fence, there's wire back, there's different woven materials, there's pool cloths, things like that. So this one is pretty strong. I never did source. I can probably dig within the MTO and source where that, whether it's still available, the availability is. I've used, when we extended that fence, we used a 200 woven, which is a very, very strong geotextile. We used it before as a semi-permanent temporary exclusion fence. Attached to a large animal fence away from the snow like it is, I think it would last, well, it has lasted 4 years and it's in mint condition. So it's that it needs to be reattached, or the washouts need to be, it didn't provide drainage. So you saw a lot of our problems with drainage. But when we cut out some of it and used rocks and Urtec, where we noticed the water was moving, we improved it. So it will last. I think it will last. I think that fence on Shepherd should be replaced probably in 5 or 6 years, but it should definitely be monitored. to see, because actually we don't really know how long it will last. We've never installed it there before.
So Kerry, would you comment maybe for some of the engineers as well, why it's important to have opaque fencing at the base? It's not just to make sure the holes are covered in terms of a large weave of a metal fence, but why opaqueness is important for reptile fencing?
Yeah, that's Cheryl Bremy's research that she says published from California. And she showed that she actually did some really intensive monitoring with cameras with herps, I think amphibians, to show, and snakes. She did a turnaround experiment, what their behavior was at different turnarounds, and whether or not they moved faster along. I think she used Urtec mesh and Animax, and she looked at, and apparently they moved faster along a solid barrier.
And they
So
don't
that
do
means less
sorry.
time exposed, right?
Okay, that's good. And then also, is there a less attempt to climb the fence when they can't see through it or not?
If they can climb it, if they can. I mean, if you have a lip and you deter them from climbing, they will try and climb if they can see through it, more so.
Okay.
That's what they looked at as well.
And the last
looked at that too.
Okay, great. The last question before we move on to the end of this presentation, or there's two, it's a rephrasing of an original question. It says, your pictures are nice and focused and the wildlife are quite close to the camera. So I was wondering if you had Reconex prepare your camera with a custom focus range.
Yeah, so yes, it's Reconex, and you can get them focused to your range. The reason why ours looked good is because we have them 3 meters on top, and so 3 meters is an ideal range for how they arrive from the factory. But you can ask the factory to give you a smaller range and to focus more closely. But I didn't do that.
Okay, and then someone asked about providing the reference related to the opaqueness of the fencing. And so we will provide as many references as we can later on this week in terms of the questions that have been asked for the different studies. And so I'll get Kerry to give me that reference later for the California study with the opaqueness of the fencing, and we'll send that out to everyone.
Sure.
Okay, so Kerry, if you would move on to the next phase with the November 4th workshop and the Nobel Road case study.
And if you want that study from California right away, if you just do a search for, I'll type it in here, Bremy, USGS, California, in Google, I'm sure it's available. They have a website with a report. So I'm sure you can find it as well. That's how I found it. Okay, so field day, Noble Road. So why on earth, when we have newer phases of mitigation along Highway 69, such as Shepherd's Lake and Musquash I talked about, which is close to Perry Sound, where all our biodiversity and Georgian Bay, and there's Healy section right near there, which has large animal fence. I'll show you, which has improved mitigation. And we have fence ends tying into rock cliffs and things like that. Why wouldn't we choose one of those sections for a field day? Well, there's various reasons why Noble Road was chosen. One is its low traffic volume, and so we can actually walk and probably see 2 cyclists and maybe 1 car in the whole trip. It's the old Highway 69. It runs parallel to Highway 69. And then the other reason was it was installed in 2011, which is close to when Shepherd's Lake was being installed, but it was a completely different type of exclusion fence. And so that would be interesting to look at. I'm not exactly, I have to find out where that mesh, it's a steel mesh, hardware mesh with a wood framework. I have to find out where that mesh was sourced, whether it's the newer mesh that they're using. So we'll look into that. And it's maintained by the Township of McDougall, but it's still an MTO road. So that's an interesting factor. We'll talk about that a little bit. Georgian Bay Biosphere also put me onto Noble Road because they had collected exclusion fence roadkill data in 2020, 9 years after the installation. So essentially their motivation was similar to what I do on a lot of my projects, is collect roadkill data to show that we need to do maintenance or make it better, to see where the issues and the problems are. So that roadkill data set is a key part of all of this, so that we can see where our problems are occurring, and then we can go and look at these locations, and also to know what kind of animals are getting killed in the area. And so there's a bit of a debate whether the mitigation on Noble Road was indeed making things better or making things worse. So with because there's a lot of access roads on Noble Road. So this is one of the big questions. So with this data set, where maintenance is needed, because maintenance hasn't been done. I don't know when maintenance was last done, but it's apparent it hasn't been done for a while. We can see that we have an unmaintained fence. So we have a baseline there. And then if we collect data afterwards, which we hope to do, but we are going to do maintenance, but we will still have the access roads. So we don't know if we're going to do adaptive management, or we're doing maintenance, minor maintenance over the next 2 or 3 days. Then we can see next year if we've actually improved the situation with the 1 or 2 access roads that are on that road. So we'll talk a little bit about the study area. So Georgian Bay Biosphere collected data in 2020, and they have a report, a field season report. It was very nicely done, and they cycled. So they got a lot of data from Avro Arrow Road, where the mitigation starts, to over here. They also have, so if we do maintenance, which I'll show you in the next slide, this is our area of focus, we will also have a control. So if we did data collection here as well, we could do BACI and show that maintenance statistically improved the situation or didn't. So whether or not that fence is functional for wildlife, did we make it better? Was it a good place to put exclusion fencing or not?
Can you explain what a BACI is, Kerry?
Oh yeah, BACI is before after control impact. So you can read about that in several papers and published papers in Ontario where we've done that, and elsewhere. So the control part of it is to control. We did this with wildlife signage. So we control for abundance, changes in abundance from one year to the next by having the control section. So if you do only a before after at the mitigated piece of road, then you could say, well, after you had less roadkill because there was a drought, and before you had more rain, and so that's why you had more roadkill, because you had more movement, and it had to do with weather, not because of the mitigation. So the control will say, well, we had less or more movement there, and we can account for that in our.
So it's pre and post monitoring and a control site and a mitigation site to compare the difference.
Yeah, before and after. It's hard to put in simple words. It's very easy to display in graphs.
Okay, so
before, after, control, impact.
Yeah, it assesses the effectiveness, and also it will give us a rationale for mitigation projects.
Yeah, it assesses effectiveness robustly.
Excellent.
Because there can be debate on whether or not it was a mitigation or not without having that control.
Okay,
so,
and this is what we look forward to doing in the next year. Thank you, Kerry.
Yeah, hopefully, if we can get funding for next year. So Noble Road is our area of focus, and we can see that there is exclusion fence. So we went and mapped this in a field visit a month ago. You can see that there's only exclusion fencing on one side, and there's none on this side. So I'm not terribly interested in this piece because I would say that exclusion fencing should not have put here at all, unless you would have done both sides. I would also say that I wouldn't put it next to Highway 69, where they're probably going to get road killed there anyway. And you're seeing pretty much a smattering of reptiles getting killed there. So I'm not too terribly excited about putting effort into that stretch. So I'm looking more at this stretch where there's two continuous almost, except for a couple access road, one here, I think, and one here for the railway that runs parallel, which is another problem why you might not want to do mitigation because of those access roads. But it depends on the site and it depends on the habitat when you make those decisions, because sometimes you only need 100 meters, 100 meters. And like on Calverhill's study site, he was able to put 200 meters on each side and effectively reduce roadkill. So is 2 meters here, 2 meters here, is that okay? Will it be okay? But the habitat's quite homogeneous. There's lots of wetlands along the stretch here, here, and here, here, and there's quite a few culverts. So we're interested to see if this mitigation is effective, but we have to get it maintained first before we can even start to look at that. So we can see that their data, and I didn't indicate by species because there's species at risk of sensitivities. And so, but we do have more snakes in this area than we do turtles being roadkill. So we want to make sure that we are helping the species at risk snakes with road impacts. So we can, what we've going to do in the field trip is everybody will get, maybe we'll email this to you before, it's in a day and a half, and or we can we'll print some copies. We're going to park at a big parking lot along Apparel Road, and then it's 500 meters to the start, and we could either walk depending on fitness and if some people want to drive, and then we're going to walk to key spots along the highway and talk about what's been roadkilled there and why, whether there's an access road or whether there was a hole in the fence. In some places, the culvert does not reach up. The fencing does not abut directly onto the culvert. Either it's moved and it needs to be improved, or in one scenario, in one of the culverts, it's actually perched because there's water running through it and there's a waterfall coming down and it's scoured the ground below so animals can move under the culvert onto the road. So in that scenario, we need to put rocks. And anywhere the GBB did also a database of what needs to be fixed. So we already know that's great. And we can correlate everything together on our desktops before we go out. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go to as many of these spots as we think we have time for. And tomorrow I'm going there to flag some of these spots and to show the type, how we did the maintenance. So we're going to be putting some Urtec fencing on the holes. We're not going to do major maintenance. Obviously, we're going to do what we can fit in the back of a truck. And with our fence pieces that we have and our drill bag, our Sawzall, our 3 shovels and some wire and a staple gun, because we have, I think we might, well, I don't think we have wood posts. Oh, the whole framework is wood. So staple gun will come in really handy, and we should be able to patch up probably, I'd say at least 60% of these breach places in one day with 2 people. And we'll definitely record that maintenance, that perch culvert. That might take a little bit of effort, and we might need to get some fill to do that. The good thing is we have a lot of Canadian Shield rock everywhere, so we can take it and move it and bring it to a spot where we need to put some a barricade or a fill in. So this is where we're meeting tomorrow at the parking lot. And I'm going to end there because that's what we're doing on the field trip. So does anybody have any questions on the field trip?
No questions have come in. If you do have questions from today to before Thursday, just email Kerry or myself at info@thelandbetween.ca, or you would have received Kerry's email in the email sent to you. And there is a couple questions coming through.
Feel free to text as well.
Okay. Yes. So in terms of safety apparel, we will be providing high-vis vests. If you've got steel toe boots, that's always better to wear than not to wear. It's not mandatory. If you have your own high-vis vests, by all means bring them. And also gloves are great. If you would like to use gloves instead of your bare hands when handling rocks, that's good. But we will have gloves and high-vis vests just in case. We'll also bring media releases because we'll be filming that day. So you'll see filming releases if you wish to be part of the film that we'll be producing on wildlife underpasses and fencing. We'll be sending out a survey maybe next week, but we'll be also in that survey sending out a list of resources that many people have shared in this group because we've got really wonderful caretakers of wildlife in this session right here who have a lot of experience in terms of road ecology and research. So a wonderful group of people attending today who have provided wonderful links for all of us. So we'll send those out to you as well. I want to remind you too that we'll be having a more fulsome design consideration workshop in December that would cover biology, behavior, materials, installation considerations. So the front end work of these infrastructure projects. Kerry, was there anything else that you wanted to add?
I think that's it. I was just gonna give a glimpse of what's up for the December workshop webinar.
That sounds great.
But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I've given away a lot already.
I think it's such a complex and important topic. I don't think you've given away too much.
You're right. There's a lot. There's 100 kinds of fencing, exclusion fencing designs and things to think about. So,
and a lot of best practices to be covered. So if you want to give us that glimpse now, we've got 10 minutes before we say goodbye or say farewell.
Okay, so this should only take 5 minutes. The maintenance can be reduced to routine upkeep, and we talked about that. If sites are adequately selected for mitigation, we talked about whether, if you don't want to put underpasses and exclusion fencing because you can't for whatever reason, then citizen science is a big one. Turtle guardians, pick up your turtles, be on your patrol. Those week 2 when turtles are moving and week 4 when turtles are moving, we know they're moving. The weather is exactly right. Snakes moved this year on October 14th and 3 of sites across Ontario. We had red bellies, brown snakes, and fox snakes moving all in 2 or 3 days. The weather was just perfect for it. So that kind of thing, it caters towards citizen science if you're ready for it. If you've got education awareness going. So those are things you could do until you get the mitigation. Obviously, we can't put underpasses and overpasses and exclusion fencing at every site and every hotspot. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of roads. So the idea is if you are going to go that path, I also think that grassroots projects have worked really well in Ontario through the Habitat Stewardship Program. And the Toronto Zoo put in some exclusion fencing. I just did one in Prince Edward County, 100 meters, 200 meters with a couple culverts that are existing is doable. And then obviously we need to get the installation selected adequately with the materials that we choose. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And a lot of it's landscaping. When you think of this, when somebody comes to assess your yard for how much it will cost for cutting the grass and looking after your garden, and they can see. I think a lot of landscapers, we could get involved in doing this kind of work rather than fence contractors. And we can, once we get the more people and training more competitive, then I don't think it should cost as much as it is costing. That's one thing we've all noticed. The prices of putting in this exclusion fencing have gone up since we started. It is hard work. We can see along Highway 69 with the Canadian Shield bedrock going up and down, following this bedrock. It's definitely hard work. Maintenance guys, definitely hats off to them for sticking it out. And you can see here with the wetlands and the water and everything, and having to add more rocks along there to keep that secure is part of the maintenance with it as well, with that type of fence on Canadian Shield rock when you can't dig a trench. So what are the solutions there? So we're going to talk a bit about that. Here, I actually walked along here and felt to see if it was still buried, and looked like it still was buried, but how long will that last? So maybe we need to get some rocks. I like rocks because gravel and fill erodes and washes away. So we're going to talk about that. But nobody's tried long stakes yet for putting those in water. I'm not sure what you could need, but we can look into some innovative materials for installation. Fence ends, we're going to talk about fence ends. We talked about the turtles going around the bridge abutment. We also found several roadkill turtles at this spot where it ended on a 5-meter cliff. So are they going along here and clambering down? And I've also heard reports from Kingston area of snapping turtles jumping from a bridge about 3 or 4, 5 meters high. So we cannot end the fence ends on a rocky outcrop that is 2 to 3 meters high. Turtles will go around that. So we have to go along the whole rocky outcrop. So that's a tough lesson to learn. It's also an expensive lesson to learn up there. And with that, so that's some of the things we're going to talk about in December. And with that, I think I'm pretty much done. And I wasn't sure what time we were going to go to, but I'm certainly got lots of, I hope everybody's learned a lot, and you all get back to your work.
Okay, and I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Eastern Georgian Bay Initiative for the support they've offered. I want to thank Georgian Bay Biosphere, and I invite everyone to look at the Mammal Opaqueness initiative that they are undertaking. It's collaborative and really appropriate nowadays. It's a wonderful, wholesome, healthy communities initiative. So I invite everyone to take a look at that and get to know what the Georgian Bay Biosphere is up to. You can also get to know what the Land Between is undertaking with our Turtle Guardians program, which is very grassroots and community science oriented. And of course, Kerry Gunson and Eco Care International. I think Kerry's name is on almost every road ecology study I've seen, but quite a few anyway. A lot of excellent work over all these years, and that's portfolio I invite everyone to look to. So we'll be in touch. We'll see anyone who's coming out on Thursday. We'll see you at the meeting site that I've sent out at 1 p.m. And we'll be in touch with great resources, with a survey to help move road ecology forward, and then also with our December workshop. And thank you so much, Kerry, for all the knowledge and so many years of such dedicated work in fair and hard times. So thanks for that.
You're welcome.
All right, we'll see everyone later, and we'll have this presentation out to you as well to share with your colleagues.
Thank you for hosting, Liara. I would never have been able to handle all of that.
All right, our pleasure. Okay.
See ya.
See ya.